Have you ever wondered if tomatoes are just harder to grow than everyone claims? Maybe you've tried for a season or two and gotten mediocre results, and you're starting to think that those Instagram photos of overflowing harvests must be fake or from people with some kind of secret knowledge. Or perhaps you're standing in the garden center right now, looking at seedlings and wondering if this year will be different, or if you're about to waste another $100 and 4 months of your life. Well, I made every classic tomato growing mistake in the book for 3 straight years before I finally figured out what I was doing wrong. And the frustrating part is that none of these mistakes required expensive solutions to fix. Today, I'm going to show you exactly what I did wrong and what finally worked when I stopped guessing. When I first started growing tomatoes, I'd walk into the garden center and grab whatever seedlings looked healthy. If the leaves were green and the stem looked sturdy, that was good enough for me. I figured a tomato plant was a tomato plant. I was completely wrong. According to University Extension Services, roughly 60% of home gardeners choose tomato varieties based on appearance and price rather than climate suitability or disease resistance. I was part of that 60%, and it cost me multiple seasons. Tomato varieties fall into 2 main categories. Determinate varieties grow to a specific height, produce fruit all at once, and then they're done. Indeterminate varieties keep growing and producing until frost kills them. But the variety type was just the beginning of what I didn't understand. Disease resistance ratings are printed right on plant tags using codes like VFN. V stands for Verticillium wilt resistance. F means Fusarium wilt resistance. N indicates nematode resistance. I ignored all of those letters because I had no idea what they meant. In my humid climate, that ignorance was devastating. I planted a beautiful heirloom called Brandywine because everyone online raved about the flavor. Within 6 weeks, the plant was covered in brown spots and wilting from early blight. Heirloom tomatoes typically have 0 disease resistance. In humid areas, they're essentially guaranteed to get hit with fungal diseases. Each seedling cost me about $4. The soil and amendments added another $15 per plant. I was investing roughly $20 per plant before it even went in the ground. A healthy tomato plant should produce 25 to 35 pounds of fruit over a season. At $3 per pound, that's $75 to $105 worth of produce per plant. I was getting maybe 2 pounds total before disease wiped them out. 2 pounds versus 30 pounds. To be fair, if you're in your first year and you don't know about disease resistance codes, grabbing any healthy-looking seedling isn't terrible. But here's the thing that really gets me. All of this information was available for free. Every state has a university extension service that publishes recommended varieties for local conditions. The information is online, it's free, and it would have taken me maybe 10 minutes to read. I chose convenience over 10 minutes of research, and it cost me 3 seasons of disappointing harvests. I thought tomatoes were tough plants that could handle just about anything. My approach to soil preparation was simple. Dig a hole, throw in some compost, mix it around, and plant the seedling. That seemed perfectly reasonable for 3 years. Turns out I was planting my tomatoes in hostile substrate. According to Extension Services, approximately 70% of home gardeners never test their soil pH before planting tomatoes. The optimal pH range is 6.2 to 6.8. Outside of that range, tomatoes can't efficiently absorb nutrients, even if those nutrients are present. When I finally got my soil tested, it came back at 5.4. At a pH of 5.4, calcium availability drops by 60 to 70% compared to optimal levels. Calcium deficiency leads directly to blossom end rot. That black sunken spot that makes fruit completely inedible. I had blossom end rot on probably 40% of the tomatoes I managed to grow. A $15 soil test would have identified the problem immediately. But pH was just one part I was getting wrong. Tomatoes need significant amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. The NPK ratio that works best is something close to the 10th of May 2010, meaning moderate nitrogen and higher phosphorus and potassium. The bagged garden soil I was buying had an NPK ratio of maybe 0.05 to 0.05 to 0.05. Essentially, nothing. The other major mistake was ignoring drainage. I have heavy clay soil, which means water doesn't move through it quickly. When you plant a tomato in clay without proper amendments, the roots sit in waterlogged conditions. Poor drainage creates symptoms that look almost identical to underwatering. The leaves wilt, the plant looks stressed, and your natural instinct is to add more water. I spent an entire season overwatering because I was misreading what the plants were telling me. Here's what proper soil preparation should have cost me. About $25 per planting area. A soil test kit costs $15. Lime to raise pH costs $8. A bag of quality fertilizer with the right NPK ratio costs around $12. So for roughly $25 and maybe an hour of labor, I could have created soil conditions that would support healthy plants. Instead, I skipped all of that and went straight to planting in inadequate soil. A healthy tomato plant produces 25 to 35 pounds of fruit, worth $75 to $105. I was losing $50 to $100 per plant in harvest value by refusing to spend $25 on proper soil preparation. But even with the wrong variety and terrible soil, I still managed to make things worse with the worst possible watering technique. Every morning, I'd head out to the garden with my hose and spray down my tomato plants. I'd make sure the leaves looked nice and wet, the stems got a good soaking, and water was dripping off everything. I thought I was being diligent. I was actually creating a disease incubator. According to Extension research, watering mistakes account for roughly 35 to 40% of tomato crop failures in home gardens. And here's what surprised me. Overwatering is significantly more common than underwatering. The first major mistake was watering the foliage instead of the soil. When you spray water directly onto tomato leaves, especially in the morning or evening when it doesn't evaporate quickly, you're creating perfect conditions for fungal diseases. Research shows that plants with consistently wet foliage are 4 to 6 times more likely to develop fungal diseases compared to plants watered at soil level. I was using about 15 gallons of water per week on 6 plants. Based on how much was running off the leaves or evaporating, I'd estimate at least 50% of that water was completely wasted. Tomato plants need about 1 to 1.5 inches of water per week, delivered directly to the root zone. That works out to roughly 2 gallons per plant per week. I was using 2.5 gallons per plant and getting worse results than if I'd used half that amount applied correctly. The second mistake was inconsistency. Some weeks I'd water every day. Other weeks I'd forget for 3 or 4 days, then panic and dump water on the plants all at once. When soil moisture fluctuates dramatically, tomato fruit responds by splitting and cracking. According to Extension data, inconsistent watering causes fruit cracking in approximately 20 to 30% of homegrown tomatoes. I had cracking on at least a third of my harvest every season. The third mistake was depth. I was watering frequently but shallowly. I'd run the hose for a couple of minutes, see the surface get wet, and figure that was good enough. But tomato roots can extend 3 to 4 feet deep. When you only wet the top few inches, you're training the roots to stay shallow. Let me add up the costs. I was wasting roughly 7 gallons per week over a 16-week season, which works out to about 110 gallons. Then add the $18 copper fungicide I bought when I inevitably got early blight. Then calculate the lost fruit from cracking and disease. If each plant should have produced 30 pounds, but disease and cracking cost me 30%, I lost about 9 pounds per plant. Times 6 plants. That's 54 pounds of tomatoes. At $3 per pound, that's $162 worth of lost harvest. All of that because I was watering the foliage instead of the soil. Could my tomatoes have survived if I'd just watered at soil level on a consistent schedule? Absolutely. But all that wasted water and those disease problems were just setting the stage for an even bigger mistake. More fertilizer equals more tomatoes, right? That's exactly what I thought when I saw a bag of high-nitrogen lawn fertilizer on sale. I figured that feeding my plants heavily would give me a massive harvest. I was working directly against my own goals. Tomatoes do need regular fertilization, but the type of fertilizer and timing matter just as much as the quantity. The NPK ratio on fertilizer bags tells you the percentage of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Nitrogen promotes leafy growth. Phosphorus supports roots and flowering. Potassium helps with fruit production. For tomatoes, you want balanced fertilizer or one slightly heavier on phosphorus and potassium, like the 10th of May 2010. The lawn fertilizer I was using had an NPK ratio of 3:0:0:0, almost pure nitrogen. When you over-fertilize tomatoes with nitrogen, the plant puts all its energy into producing foliage. You get massive plants with thick stems and gorgeous dark green leaves. And then barely any fruit appears. My plants were regularly 5 or 6 feet tall with lush foliage. I'd look at them and think I was doing an amazing job. Then harvest would come and I'd get maybe 8 to 10 tomatoes per plant. According to agricultural research, excessive nitrogen can reduce fruit set by 40 to 60% compared to proper fertilization. I was creating perfect conditions for low yields and wondering why my harvest was disappointing. But the problem went beyond just low production. Plants pushed too hard with nitrogen become softer and more susceptible to disease. The lush growth I thought was healthy was actually making my plants more vulnerable. The other mistake was neglecting calcium and magnesium. Even when pH is correct, tomatoes need adequate calcium to prevent blossom end rot. Most balanced tomato fertilizers include calcium and magnesium. My lawn fertilizer had neither. Then there's timing. Tomatoes have different nutritional needs at different stages. At transplanting, they need phosphorus for strong roots. During vegetative growth, they need moderate nitrogen. At flowering and fruiting, they need more potassium and consistent calcium. I was dumping high nitrogen fertilizer every 2 weeks regardless of growth stage. I spent about $40 per season on the wrong fertilizer. But the real cost was in lost harvest. If each plant should have produced 40 pounds but I was only getting 8 pounds because of fertilization mistakes, I was losing 32 pounds per plant. With 6 plants, that's 192 pounds of lost tomatoes. At $3 per pound, that's nearly $600 worth of harvest value. $600 in lost harvest because I refused to spend 10 minutes learning what NPK ratios actually mean. The research on tomato fertilization is extensive and freely available. Extension Services publish detailed guides on exactly what to use and when. I just assumed I knew better. And then, when my over-fertilized, nitrogen-loaded, calcium-deficient plants were already stressed, disease hit. I walked out to my garden one morning, and half my tomato plants had brown, withering leaves spreading up from the bottom. Within a week, I'd lost 4 out of 6 plants entirely. Early blight. According to Extension Services, fungal diseases account for approximately 50 to 60% of total crop loss in home tomato gardens. Early blight, septoria leaf spot, and late blight are the most common, and all 3 thrive under the exact conditions I'd been creating. Early blight is caused by a fungus present in most garden soils already. It's waiting for the right conditions. Those conditions include wet foliage, stressed plants, inadequate nutrition, poor air circulation, and plants that lack disease resistance. I'd created every single one. The causal chain was obvious once I understood it. I'd chosen heirloom varieties with 0 disease resistance. I'd planted them in soil with wrong pH and inadequate nutrition. I'd watered the foliage, keeping leaves wet. And I'd over-fertilized with nitrogen, making the plants even more susceptible. Every single factor was within my control, and I'd gotten them all wrong. Each plant represented a potential harvest of 25 to 35 pounds. At $3 per pound, that's $75 to $105 worth of produce per plant. I lost 4 plants completely, which means somewhere between $300 and $420 in lost harvest from that single disease event. I panicked and bought copper fungicide for $22, thinking I could save the remaining plants. I applied it according to instructions, which helped slow the progression but couldn't reverse the damage already done. Here's what I didn't understand. Fungicides are preventive, not curative. Once fungal disease has established itself in plant tissue, spraying is like trying to put out a house fire with a garden hose. According to research, preventive fungicide applications can reduce disease incidence by 60 to 80% compared to waiting until you see symptoms. I was doing everything backwards. Research also shows that roughly 40% of home gardeners who experience catastrophic disease loss give up on growing tomatoes entirely. I was very close to becoming part of that 40%. This was the moment I realized I didn't actually know what I was doing. I'd been guessing and assuming, and the results spoke for themselves. 4 dead plants. maybe 20 tomatoes from the 2 survivors, months of work, and over $100 in expenses for a harvest that wouldn't fill a grocery bag. It wasn't the plant's fault, it was me. After that disaster, I finally started researching what experienced growers do differently. And the first thing I learned was that I'd been sabotaging my plants from the moment I put them in the ground. I wanted maximum tomatoes, so I planted my seedlings 18 inches apart. The extension office recommends 4 to 36 inches. There's a reason for that spacing. According to research, approximately 65% of gardeners plant tomatoes closer together than recommended. The thinking makes sense. More plants in the same space should equal more tomatoes, right? It doesn't work that way. When you plant tomatoes too close together, they compete for nutrients. 6 plants, spaced 18 inches apart, are drawing from a much smaller soil volume than 6 plants spaced 36 inches apart. Second, inadequate spacing destroys air circulation. When plants are crowded, their foliage overlaps and creates dense, humid microclimates where fungal spores love to establish themselves. Research shows that plants with inadequate spacing are 2 to 3 times more likely to develop fungal diseases even when all other factors are identical. The third problem is reduced fruit production. When plants are competing for light, water, and nutrients, they put energy into survival rather than reproduction. My cramped plants averaged 6 to 8 tomatoes each. Properly spaced plants routinely produce 25 to 40 fruits. Let me do that math. 6 plants at 8 tomatoes each gives you 48 tomatoes total. 6 plants at 30 tomatoes each gives you 180 tomatoes. I was losing 132 tomatoes, or roughly 73% of my potential harvest, just from spacing errors. But spacing was only half the mistake. The other half was pruning, or rather, my complete lack of it. Indeterminate varieties produce side shoots called suckers that grow between the main stem and branches. If you let all the suckers grow, you end up with a massive, sprawling plant with tons of foliage and mediocre fruit production. According to extension guidelines, proper sucker removal can increase average fruit size by 20 to 30% and reduce disease by improving air circulation. I didn't remove a single sucker for 3 years. I didn't even know what a sucker was. My plants looked like uncontrolled bushes, sprawling in every direction. And because I'd planted them so close together, this created an almost impenetrable wall of foliage. The final mistake was inadequate support. I used basic wire cages, maybe 4 feet tall. Indeterminate plants can easily grow 6 to 8 feet tall. My plants would outgrow the cages by mid-season, then flop over onto the ground. Once fruit touches the ground, it's vulnerable to rot and disease. I probably lost 15 to 20% of the fruit I did grow just from ground contact. Here's what I find fascinating about spacing and pruning mistakes. They're completely counterintuitive. Logic tells you more plants equals more tomatoes, but the data shows the opposite. Fewer plants with proper spacing produces dramatically higher total yields. This information is free and widely available in every state's extension publications. I just never bothered to read it. Once I understood these mistakes, everything changed. The next season, I did everything I'd refused to do before. I tested my soil, chose disease-resistant varieties, spaced the plants properly, and actually followed the guidelines. And my 6 plants produced over 180 tomatoes. Here's exactly what changed. First, variety selection. I chose a disease-resistant hybrid called Mountain Fresh Plus with a VFN rating. Not an heirloom with 0 protection, but a variety specifically bred to handle challenges in my region. Second, soil preparation. I tested the pH, found it was still at 5.4, and amended it with lime to bring it up to 6.5. I incorporated balanced fertilizer with the 10th of May 2010 NPK ratio at planting, along with calcium in the form of gypsum. Total cost for soil amendments was about $35. Third, watering. I installed a simple drip irrigation system, with emitters positioned at the base of each plant. No more foliar watering. The system delivered 1.5 inches per week, directly to the root zone on a timer. Cost was $45, but it paid for itself immediately. Fourth, fertilization. I used tomato-specific fertilizer with the right NPK balance and applied it according to growth stage. Moderate fertilizer at transplanting, then side-dressed when the first flowers appeared. I also added calcium periodically. No more high nitrogen lawn fertilizer. Fifth, spacing and pruning. I planted seedlings 30 inches apart instead of 18. I removed suckers weekly, training each plant to 2 main stems. I used 6-foot stakes with proper support ties. The difference in air circulation was immediately obvious. The results were dramatic. Each plant produced between 28 and 32 tomatoes, for a total of about 180 fruits. Compare that to the 8 tomatoes I got in my worst year, or the 40 to 50 inches my best year before these changes. Disease incidence dropped to almost nothing. I saw a few early blight spots late in the season, but nothing that affected harvest. No catastrophic outbreaks, no dead plants. Fruit quality improved significantly. Almost no blossom end rot because pH and calcium were correct. Minimal cracking because watering was consistent. Larger average fruit size because plants weren't overcrowded. Let me calculate the return. I spent about $60 on soil amendments, drip irrigation, stakes, and correct fertilizer. The harvest was roughly 180 tomatoes, averaging half a pound each, which works out to 90 pounds of fruit. At $3 per pound, that's $270 worth of produce from a $60 investment. Compare that to my previous results. Best case, I'd harvested maybe 25 pounds worth $75. Worst case, 4 pounds worth $12. The new approach increased my harvest value by 260% compared to my previous best. But here's what really changed: the stress. In previous years, I was constantly worried. Were they getting enough water? Why were the leaves yellow? Why no fruit? The entire season was anxiety-inducing. After implementing proper practices, growing tomatoes became straightforward. Not effortless, but predictable. I knew what to expect at each stage. The guesswork was gone. This isn't complicated. You don't need to be a master gardener. You just need to stop ignoring the basics that work. Looking back at those wasted seasons, the most frustrating part isn't the mistakes themselves. It's how easily they could have been avoided if I'd just been willing to learn first. I spent 3 years barely harvesting anything because I thought tomatoes were supposed to be easy. Everyone says they want a great harvest, but most gardeners don't actually implement proven practices. According to extension data, the average home gardener harvests 8 to 12 tomatoes per plant. Properly managed plants can produce 25 to 40 fruits. That's not a small difference. That's a complete transformation. Here's what I find most interesting: the gap between what people say they want and what they actually do. Everyone wants abundant harvests. Everyone complains when disease wipes out their crop. But the average gardener still plants the wrong varieties, skips soil testing, waters inconsistently, over-fertilizes with nitrogen, and ignores spacing guidelines. Maybe it's because most people don't know what good results look like, so they accept mediocrity as normal. Maybe they assume everyone else is struggling too. Or maybe they don't know where to start. If you're reading this, and some of these mistakes hit close to home, don't panic. The fact that you're here trying to learn already puts you ahead of most gardeners. Most people never take the time to figure out what they're doing wrong. The key is to use these mistakes as motivation, not as an excuse to give up. If you've been getting 8 tomatoes per plant and you're frustrated, that doesn't mean you're doomed. It means you have some specific, fixable problems to address. Maybe you're already doing some things right. Maybe you've got spacing correct, but fertilization is off. Or maybe you're great at soil prep, but you've been watering the foliage. The point isn't to feel bad about past mistakes. The point is to recognize what needs to change. The bottom line is this: these mistakes should be informative, but they should also be empowering. When you know what the average gardener does wrong, you can make informed decisions about whether you want to keep doing those same things or get better results. Personally, I think you deserve better than harvesting 8 tomatoes from plants you've been tending for 4 months. You deserve better than watching disease kill your crop year after year because you're creating perfect conditions for it. You deserve the satisfaction that comes with pulling in basketfuls of tomatoes from plants that are actually thriving. These mistakes show where most gardeners fail, but they don't have to define where you end up. Use them as a starting point, not as a ceiling. Because once you understand what most people are doing wrong, it becomes pretty clear how to do something different and get dramatically better results. Test your soil. Choose disease-resistant varieties. Space properly. Water at soil level consistently. Use balanced fertilization. Prune your indeterminate varieties. Provide adequate support. None of that requires special equipment or years of experience. It just requires being more intentional than the average gardener. The choice is yours.